Well, the days went along, and the river went down between its banks again. Next morning I said it was getting slow and dull, and I wanted to get it stirring up some way. I said I reckoned I would slip over the river and find out what was going on. Jim liked that notion, but he said I must go in the dark and look sharp. Then he studied it over and said, couldn't I put on some of them old things and dress up like a girl? So we shortened up one of the calico gowns and turned up my trouser legs to my knees and got into it. I put on the sunbonnet and tied it under my chin, and then for a body to look in and see my face was like looking down a joint of stovepipe. Jim said nobody would know me, even in the daytime, hardly. I practiced around all day to get the hang of things, only Jim said I didn't walk like a girl, and he said I must quit pulling up my gown to get at my breeches pocket. I took notice, and I done better. I started up the Illinois shore in the canoe just after dark, and the drift of the current fetched me in at the bottom of town. There was a light burning in a little shanty that hadn't been lived in for a long time, and I wondered who had took up quarters there. I slipped up and peeped in at the window. There was a woman about 40-year-old in there, knitting by a candle that was on a pine table. I didn't know her face. She was a stranger. There weren't a face in that town that I didn't know. I knocked at the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl. "Come in," says the woman, and I did. "What might your name be?" "Sarah Williams." "Whereabouts do you live, in this neighborhood?" "No, ma'am, in Hookerville, 7 miles below. I've walked all the way. My mother's down sick and out of money and everything, and I come to tell my uncle, Abner Moore. He lives at the upper end of town," she says. "I ain't ever been here before. Do you know him?" "No, but I don't know everybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a considerable ways to the upper end of town. You better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet." "No," I says. "I'll rest a while, I reckon, and go on. I ain't afeard of the dark." She said she wouldn't let me go by myself, but her husband would be in by and by, and she'd send him along with me. Then she got to talking about her husband and about how much better off they used to was, and so on. But by and by she dropped on to Pap and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her clatter right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000, only she got it to 10, and all about Pap and what a hard lot he was, and at last she got down to where I was murdered. And I says, "Who done it? We heard considerable about these goings-on down in Hookerville." "Well, some think old Finn done it himself." "No, is that so?" "Most everybody thought it at first. He'll never know how close he come to getting lynched. But before night they changed around and judged it was done by a runaway slave named Jim. He run off the very night Huck Finn was killed. So there's a reward out for him, $300, and there's a reward out for old Finn, too, $200. You see, he come to town the morning after the murder and told about it, and was out with them on the ferry boat hunt, and right away after he up and left. Before night they wanted to lynch him, but he was gone, you see. Well, next day they found out the slave was gone, so then they put it on him, you see. And while they was full of it, next day back comes old Finn and went boo-hooing to Judge Thatcher to get money to hunt for the slave all over Illinois with. The judge gave him some, and that evening he got drunk and was around till after midnight with a couple of mighty hard-looking strangers, and then went off with them. Well, he ain't come back since, and they ain't looking for him back till this thing blows over a little. People thinks now that he killed his boy and fixed things so folks would think robbers done it, and then he'd get Huck's money without having to bother a long time with the lawsuit. Has everybody quit thinking the slave done it? Oh, no, not everybody. A good many thinks he done it, but they'll get him pretty soon now, and maybe they can scare it out of him. Why, are they after him yet? Well, you're innocent, ain't you? Does $300 lay around every day for people to pick up? Some folks think the slave ain't far from here. I was pretty near certain I'd seen smoke about the head of Jackson's Island. So I says to myself, like as not, that slave's hiding over there. My husband's going over to see, him and another man. Is your husband going over there tonight? Oh, yes, he went uptown with the man I was telling you of to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go over after midnight." The woman kept looking at me curious, and I didn't feel a bit comfortable. And pretty soon she says, "What'd you say your name was, honey?" "Mary Williams." Somehow it didn't seem to me that I'd said it was Mary before. It seemed to me I said it was Sarah. So I felt sort of concerned and was afeard maybe I was looking it too. "Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first come in." "Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary. Come now, what's your real name? Is it Bill or Tom or Bob? Or what is it? I ain't gonna hurt you and I ain't gonna tell on you nother. You see, you're a runaway prentice, that's all. It ain't anything. There ain't no harm in it. You've been treated bad and you made up your mind to cut. Bless you, child, I wouldn't tell on you." So I said it wouldn't be no use to try to play it any longer, and I would just make a clean breast and tell her everything. Then I told her my father and mother was dead, and the law had bound me out to a mean old farmer in the country 30 miles back from the river, and he treated me so bad I couldn't stand it no longer. He went away to be gone a couple of days, so I took my chance and stole some of his daughter's old clothes and cleared out. I said I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me, and so that was why I struck out for this town of Goshen. "Goshen, child? This ain't Goshen. This is St. Petersburg. Goshen's 10 miles further up the river." "Then I gotta be moving along. I'll fetch Goshen before daylight." "Hold on a minute. I'll put you up a snack to eat. Now, what's your real name?" "George Peters, Mum." "Well, try to remember it, George. Don't forget and tell me it's Alexander before you go, and then get out by saying it's George Alexander when I catch you. And don't go about women in that old calico. You do a girl tolerable poor, but you might fool men, maybe. Now trot along to your uncle, Sarah Mary Williams George Alexander Peters. If you get into trouble, you send word to Mrs. Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it." I went up the bank about 50 yards, and then I doubled on my tracks and slipped back to where my canoe was, a good piece below the house. I jumped in and was off in a hurry, and when I struck the head of the island, I shoved right into the timber where my old camp used to be and started a good fire there on a high and dry spot. Then I jumped in the canoe and dug out for our place 1.5 miles below. I landed and slopped through the timber and up the ridge and into the cavern, and there Jim laid, sound asleep on the ground. I roused him out and says, "Get up, Jim. They ain't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked no questions. He never said a word. But the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time, everything we had in the world was on our raft, and she was ready to be shoved out from the willow cover where she was hid. If the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it weren't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side and hacked off cottonwood branches with a hatchet and covered up the raft with them, so she looked like there'd been a cave-in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket and looked up and down and across. Nothing in sight. Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam, we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep with a frame around it for to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. This night we run between 7 and 8 hours with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all. That night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bit of lights. Not a house could you see. The fifth night we passed St. Louis, and it was like a whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg, they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that weren't roosting comfortable and took him along. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo at the bottom of Illinois where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with the line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was still a current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots and away she went. I see the fog closing down. It made me sick and scared, and I couldn't budge for most a half-minute. And then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. And soon as I got started, I took out after the raft hot and heavy, right down the towhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towhead weren't 60 yards long. And the minute I flew by the foot of it, I shot out into the solid white fog and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come, I see I weren't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it. And the next time I was heading way to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around this way and that and t'other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a-booming down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared, the current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two, it was solid white and still again. I sat perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down t'other side of it. It warn't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour. But you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you're laying dead still in the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by, you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in a fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once, you'll see. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckoned Jim had fetched up on a snag maybe, and it was all over with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap. When I waked up, the stars was shining bright. The fog was all gone. I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming. And then things began to come back to me. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was sitting there with his head down between his knees, asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft and began to gap and stretch my fists against Jim, and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?" "Goodness gracious, is that you, Huck? And you ain't dead? You ain't drownded? You's back again? It's too good for true, honey." "What's the matter with you, Jim? What makes you talk so wild?" Well, looky here, didn't the line pull loose and the raft go humming down the river and leave you and the canoe behind in the fog? Well, Jim, I ain't seen no fog, nor no troubles, nor nothing. I've been setting here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't have got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreaming. Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but he sat there studying over it. And then he says, "Well, then, I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see." "Tell me all about it, Jim." So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. A lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into, but if we minded our business, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. "Oh, well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim," I says, but what does these things stand for?" It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft and the smashed door. It was clearing up now so you could see them first rate. Jim looked at the trash and then looked at me and back at the trash again. He'd got the dream so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady without ever smiling and says, "What do they stand for? I'm going to tell you. When I got all wore out with work and with the calling for you and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost and I didn't care no more what became of me and the raft. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck there is trash. Trash is what people is that puts dirt on the head of their friends and makes 'em ashamed." Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a slave, but I done it. And I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards, neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't have done that one if I'd knowed it would make him feel that way. We slept most all day and started out at night. We talked about Cairo and wondered whether we'd know it when we got to it. I said likely we wouldn't because I'd heard say they weren't but about a dozen houses there, and if they didn't happen to have 'em lit up, how was we going to know when we was passing the town? Jim said if the two big rivers joined together there, that would show. Jim said it made him all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too to hear him, because I begun to get it through my head that he was most free. And who was to blame for it? Why, me. I couldn't get that out of my conscience no how nor no way. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you that you could see her slave go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? I got to feeling so mean and so miserable I most wished I was dead. Jim was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go to saving up money and never spend a single cent. And when he got enough, he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived. And then they would both work to buy the two children, and if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. My conscience got to stirring me up hotter than ever until at last I says to it, "Let up on me. It ain't too late yet. I'll paddle ashore at the first light and tell." I went to looking out sharp for a light, and by one showed. Jim sings out, "We safe, Huck. We safe. Jump up and crack your heels. That's the good old Cairo at last. I just knows it." I says, "I'll take the canoe and go see, Jim. It mightn't be, you know." He jumped and got the canoe ready and put his old coat in the bottom for me to set on and give me the paddle. As I shoved off, he says, Pretty soon I'll be a-shouting for joy, and I'll say it's all on accounts of Huck. I's a free man, and I couldn't have ever been free if it hadn't been for Huck. Huck done it. Jim won't ever forget you, Huck. You the best friend Jim's ever had, and you's the only friend old Jim's got now." I was paddling off, all in a sweat to tell on him, but when he says this, it seemed to kind of take the tuck all out of me. Right then along comes a skiff with 2 men in it with guns, and they stopped and I stopped, and one of them says, "What's that yonder?" "Piece of raft," I says. "Any men on it?" "Only one, sir." "Well, there's 5 slaves run off tonight up yonder above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black?" I didn't answer up prompt. I tried for a second or two to brace up and out with it, but I warn't man enough. I see I was weakening, so I just give up trying and up and says, "He's white." "I reckon we'll go and see for ourselves." "I wish you would," says I, "because it's Pap that's there, and maybe you could help me tow the raft ashore where the light is. He's sick, and so is Ma'am and Mary Ann. Everybody goes away when I want 'em to help me tow the raft ashore, and I can't do it by myself." "Well, that's infernal mean. Odd, too. Say, boy, what's the matter with your father?" "It's well, it ain't anything much." They stopped pulling. It weren't but a mighty little ways to the raft now. And one says, "Boy, that's a lie. What is the matter with your pap?" "It's gentlemen, if you'll only pull ahead and let me heave you the headline, you won't have to come near the raft. Please do." "Set her back, John, set her back," says one. They backed water. "Confound it, I just expect the wind has blowed it to us. Your pap's got the smallpox, and you know it precious well. Why didn't you come out and say so?" "Well," says I, blubbering, I've told everybody before. They just went away and left us. Poor devil, we're right down sorry for you, but well, hang it, we don't want the smallpox, you see. Look here, I'll tell you what to do. You float along down about 20 miles, and you'll come to a town on the left-hand side of the river. When you ask for help, you tell 'em your folks are all down with chills and fever. Don't be a fool again and let people guess what's the matter. Say, I reckon your father's poor, and I'm bound to say he's in pretty hard luck. Here, I'll put a $20 gold piece on this board, and you get it when it floats by. I feel mighty mean to leave you, but my kingdom, it wouldn't do to fool with smallpox, don't you see?" They went off, and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low, because I knowed very well I had done wrong, and I see it warn't no use for me to try to learn to do right. A body that don't get started right when he's little ain't got no show. Then I thought a minute, and I says to myself, hold on. Suppose you'd have done right and give Jim up. Would you have felt better then than what you do now? "No," says I, "I'd feel bad." "Well then," says I, "what's the use you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is just the same?" Towards daybreak we tied up, and Jim was mighty particular about hiding the raft good. Then he worked all day fixing things in bundles and getting all ready to quit rafting. That night about 10, we hove in sight of the lights of a town away down in a left-hand bend. I went off in the canoe to ask about it. Pretty soon I found a man out in the river with a skiff setting a trot line. I ranged up and said, "Mister, is that town Cairo?" "Cairo? No, you must be a blame fool." "Oh, what town is it, mister?" "If you want to know, go and find out. If you stay here bothering around me for about a half a minute longer, you'll get something you won't want." I paddled to the raft. Jim was awful disappointed, but I said never mind, Cairo would be the next place, I reckoned. We passed another town before daylight, but it was high ground, so I didn't go. "No high ground about Cairo," Jim said. I begun to suspicion something. So did Jim. I says, "Maybe we went by Cairo in the fog that night." He says, "Don't let's talk about it, Huck. Post slaves can't have no luck." When it was daylight, here was the clear Ohio water inshore, sure enough, and outside was the old regular muddy. So it was all up with Cairo. We talked it all over. It wouldn't do to take to the shore. We couldn't take the raft up the stream, of course. There warn't no way but to wait for dark and start back in the canoe and take the chances. So we slept all day amongst the cottonwood thicket so as to be fresh for the work, and when we went back to the raft about dark, the canoe was gone. We didn't say a word for a good while. By and by we talked about what we better do and found there warn't no way but just to go along down with the raft till we got a chance to buy a canoe to go back in. So we shoved out after dark on the raft. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckon I might say they swum by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window. And sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, on a raft or a scow, you know, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at 'em and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could have laid 'em. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I've seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they'd got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. One morning about daybreak, I found a canoe and crossed over a chute to the main shore. It was only 200 yards, and paddled about a mile up a creek amongst the cypress woods to see if I couldn't get some berries. Just as I was passing a place where a kind of a cow path crossed the creek, here comes a couple of men tearing up the path as tight as they could foot it. I was about to dig out from there in a hurry, but they was pretty close to me and sung out and begged me to save their lives. Said they hadn't been doing nothing and was being chased for it. Said there was men and dogs a-coming. They wanted to jump right in, but I says, "Don't you do it. I don't hear the dogs and horses yet. You got time to crowd through the brush, get up the creek a little ways, then you take to the water and wade down to me and get in. That'll throw the dogs off the scent." They done it, and as soon as they was aboard, I lit out for our towhead, and in about 5 minutes we heard the dogs and the men way off, shouting. We heard 'em come along towards the creek. They seemed to stop and fool around a while. Then, as we got further and further away, we couldn't hardly hear 'em at all. One of these fellows was about 70 or upwards and had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old battered-up slouch hat on and a greasy blue woolen shirt and ragged old blue jeans breeches stuffed into his boot tops, and both of them had big, fat, ratty-looking carpet bags. The other fellow was about 30 and dressed about as ornery. After breakfast, we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that came out was that these chaps didn't know one another. "What got you into trouble?" says the bald head to the other chap. "Well, I'd been selling an article to take the tartar off the teeth, and it does take it off, too, and generally the enamel goes along with it. But I stayed about one night longer than I ought to, and it was just in the act of sliding out when I ran across you on the trail this side of town. That's the whole yarn. What's yourn?" "Well, I'd been running a little temperance revival there about a week and was the pet of the women folk, big and little, when somehow a little report got around that I had a way of putting in my time with a private jug on the sly. I was rousted out this morning and told the people was gathering on the quiet with their dogs and horses, and they'd be along pretty soon and give me about a half an hour's start and then run me down if they could." "Oh, man, I reckon we might double-team it together. What do you think?" said the young one. "I ain't indisposed. What's your line, mainly?" "Printer by trade, do a little in patent medicines, theater actor, take a turn to mesmerism and phrenology when there's a chance. Most anything that comes in handy so it ain't work. What's your lay?" "I've done considerable in the doctoring way in my time, and I can tell a fortune pretty good when I've got somebody along to find out the facts for me. Preaching's my line, too, and working camp meetings and missionarying around." Nobody never said anything for a while, and then the young man hove a sigh and says, "Alas." "What are you laughing about?" says the bald head. "Ah, you would not believe me. The world never believes. Let it pass, 'tis no matter. The secret of my birth." "The secret of your birth? Do you mean to say—" "Gentlemen, I will reveal it to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights, I am a duke." Jim's eyes bugged out when he heard that. I reckon mine did, too. And then the bald head says, "No, you can't mean it." Yes, my great-grandfather, the eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country about the end of the last century, married here, and died leaving a son, his own father dying about the same time. The second son of the late Duke seized the titles and estates. The infant real Duke was ignored. I am the lineal descendant of that infant. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater. And here am I, forlorn, torn from my high estate, hunted by men, despised by the cold world, ragged, worn, heartbroken, and degraded to the companionship of felons on a raft. Well, Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him and say, "Your Grace," or "My Lord," or "Your Lordship." And he wouldn't mind it if we called him plain Bridgewater, which he said was a title anyway, and not a name. And one of us ought to wait on him at dinner and do any little thing for him he wanted done. Well, that was all easy, so we done it, and a body could see it was mighty pleasing to him. But the old man got pretty silent by and by, didn't have much to say, and didn't look pretty comfortable over all that petting that was going on around the Duke. He seemed to have something on his mind, so along in the afternoon he says, "Looky here, Bilgewater, I'm nation sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that's had troubles like that." "Alas." "No, you ain't the only person that's had a secret of his birth." And by jings, he begins to cry. "Hold, what do you mean?" "Bilgewater, can I trust you?" says the old man, still sort of sobbing. The Duke took the old man by the hand and squeezed it and says, "To the bitter death, the secret of your being, speak." "Bilgewater, I am the late Dauphin." You bet Jim and me stared this time. Then the Duke says, "You are what?" "Yes, my friend, it is too true. Your eyes is looking at this very moment on the poor disappeared Dauphin, Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and Mary Antoinette. Yes, gentlemen, you see before you in blue jeans and misery the wandering, exiled, trampled on, and suffering rightful King of France." Well, he cried and took on so that me and Jim didn't know hardly what to do. But he said it warn't no use, though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people treated him according to his rights, and got down on one knee to speak to him, and always called him Your Majesty and waited on him first at meals.